Hey everybody, welcome back. We're going to have another environmental science lecture today that covers, in this case, industrial agriculture and the food supply. We've been covering a lot of different subjects, but the food supply is where the rubber really meets the road with human beings on planet Earth, because that's where we get our sustenance from. That's where we connect to the Earth directly. Besides just not only giving us housing and a place to live, it actually gives us what we need to survive as human beings. And so that's what this lecture is going to be about. I think you're really going to enjoy it. A lot of people don't know where their food comes from. They don't really even think about it. They're just kind of glad when they get their hamburger or whatever it is that they're trying to get at a restaurant. They're just glad to have it. They don't think about what's behind it. They don't think about whether or not the farmers are making money. They don't think about any of that stuff. They're just glad they have the food. So we're going to talk a little bit about this, and we're going to realize as we go through it, by the end, there's problems, and those problems are building up. And so the question is going to be, is there any solutions to these problems? So I hope you'll enjoy this one, and then like I said, we'll pick up that theme in the next lecture where we talk about possible solutions, which might fit the lifestyles for many people. All right, so let's start talking about food itself. So here we have a central case study, transgenic maize in southern Mexico. So corn or maize originated in Mexico about 9,000 years ago. In fact, here's a map of Mexico here, and it is commonly believed that it started right around in this area in the Oaxaca region of Mexico. So Mexico is the home to many what we call corn land races. Now, a land race is a locally adopted domestic variety. So there are many different varieties of corn in Mexico. There's not just one. There's, as we look down here, we can actually see pretty rapidly, there's a whole series, different colors, different types, that have different size kernels, everything, right? There's a tremendous amount of difference. In 2001, genes from a genetically modified corn appeared in traditional maize or corn. So here we have a situation where something that's genetically modified, something that's created in a lab, has left the lab, has gone into the field, and now that field is now reproducing with what is traditional and what is native to that area. Okay, so that was detected in 2001, and of course those transgenes are from the United States. So it's genetically modified corn that has reproduced itself and commingled itself with traditional Mexican corn in the very area where corn originated, right down in here. And by the way, what this is showing you is two different varieties of early corn that are adopted to different environments. And so the pink is one region, and the blue here is another. And this is where we think corn came from, about 9,000 years ago. So these transgenes came from U.S. corn, and we call these things, by the way, genetically modified organisms, or GMOs. So these are organisms whose genes have been directly manipulated by human beings. Okay, in other words, this is where United States, where American scientists, in the case of corn, sought out to create a type of corn that had certain characteristics, and they didn't just breed it, but they actually went in and changed the genes itself using advanced biotechnology. Okay, so these GMOs could contaminate native crops, and in fact, they can even outproduce them and completely take over. And the impact of genetically modified corn is difficult to assess because we're in the middle of doing this experiment on ourselves. Once we've done the experiment, it's actually very difficult to dial it back. But you can understand why people might want to do this. For example, if we read this sign over here, it says insect-resistant maize from Africa, insect-resistant maize for Africa. So the purpose of this is to create a type of corn that doesn't require a large amount of pesticides. So it's a pest-resistant type of corn. And so who can argue against that, right? Well, we'll see how you feel about it at the end of this lecture, okay, and the end of the next lecture as well. One of the things that we are currently doing in the world is we're producing more food per person. This has been a goal of human beings for a very long time, probably from the very start. We really only have been collecting data for a relatively short period of time of human history, but there's dramatic trends that are happening. So the human population is expected to reach 9 billion people by 2050. Right now, as I'm recording this, we're nearing 8 billion. We'll probably pass 8 billion very quickly. This means that 2 billion more people will need to be fed. Food production has exceeded population growth over the last 50 years. Well, that's a good thing, right? If the population is growing, we want to make sure those people are not only fed, but they're fed well. And we know that in the past, a lot of countries were starving and they were having difficulty getting the amount of nutrition that they need. And we're going to talk a little bit about that here in a few slides. But what we're seeing is a dramatic improvement in the lifestyles or the food availability for a lot of people across the world. So as that population increases, that means that there's going to be plenty of nutrition ready for them, hopefully, right? And in fact, when we look at the trends here is the supply, or the kilograms per capita, or this is the number of kilograms of food per person in these areas. So the United States are these white boxes right here, and Europe is right kind of at about the same level, right up until about 1985, and then there's a slight divergence. The average American in the United States consumes, it looks like, approximately 10 kilograms, possibly, yeah, but 15 to 20 kilograms more per year than the average European. But that number is actually pretty interesting compared to the developing countries of the world. So here's the world number, and you can see the world number has gone from 60 all the way up over 100. So the world, on average, is where the United States was in 1980. And by the way, the United States was not starving in 1980. This is a good number for the world, for everybody on the planet. And most of that improvement occurs in low-income food deficit countries. So we see these numbers improving dramatically. Now, the place where we're not seeing the kinds of improvements that we're hoping for is in Africa. Africa is located right here on this line, and we'll notice that this line continues straight from the left side of the graph to the right side of the graph. It looks like there's an uptick right at about 2000, from 1995 to 2000. That's a positive uptick. I unfortunately don't have any data that's more recent than that. This is from a scholarly article that I pulled this from. But we could see, I'm sorry, what I said, this is the food supply. I should say it's the supply of vegetables per person. The African vegetable supply has stayed very low and very consistent. So this is an area of dramatic need that we need to improve, okay? Now, we produce food currently through technology. We use fossil fuels, irrigation, fertilizer, pesticides. We cultivate more land. We use genetic engineering. And today, soils are in decline, and most arable land is already farmed. So there's not really there's not a whole lot more we can do with the land we currently have. We can't just go out and just clear more forest. I mean, I guess we could, but there's not going to be a whole lot of productivity coming out of those areas. We're pretty much farming everything that is going to give us a high yield, right? So this right here that we're seeing from about 1980, let's go back to 1970, all the way up to about 2000, is caused by a different phenomenon. And I've mentioned it a few times in previous lectures, but we're going to get into it a little bit more deeply in this one. It's called the Green Revolution. So currently we face undernutrition, overnutrition, and malnutrition. There's three different things that we've got to deal with. So currently, despite the fact that there's so many vegetables, there's so much meat in the world, there's plenty to eat in theory, there's still 870 million people that do not have enough to eat on a daily basis. And there's three different ways that we characterize this, right? This is undernutrition. Actually, overnutrition can also be a major issue, because that means they're not possibly eating healthy food, right? They have junk food to eat, but they don't have, say, an apple or an orange, but they've got a candy bar, right? So candy bars are cheap, they're easy to get a hold of, and they're common, right? Whereas in some places, apples are not. And of course, there's malnutrition as well. So undernutrition, people receive fewer calories than their minimum requirements. So due to economics, politics, conflict, and inefficiencies in distribution, this can happen, right? I mean, if you happen to live in an area where you have a good market economy, it's really easy to get food if you have a job, right? Or if you're connected into that economy well. If you have some type of socioeconomic disadvantage, it could be difficult to tap into that. You might be subjected to that undernutrition situation. In terms of the number of people worldwide that are undernourished, we've done a good job of actually tackling that situation. This is the number of people who are undernourished in 1991. It's about 1 billion people. And we can see that the number has steadily declined. I mean, it has moments where it goes up. In fact, the reason why this went up is because food prices dramatically went up at this time. Some people argue that this was inflation. This was also a period of time called the Iraq War, when the US dollar, which was the reserve currency of the world, was being printed very rapidly by the United States government to finance that war and to increase the deficit. But as the war kind of teetered off, we'll notice that there's a resumption back to that trend line, and the numbers went back down. And recently, there's been a little uptick again. But overall, the trend is down. The other positive thing that is happening is while this trend from 1 billion down to 800 million has gone down, right? The population of the world has gone up. So the overall percentage of the population of the world that is undernourished has gone down dramatically. Okay, so most undernourished live in developing countries, but 50 million Americans are what we call food insecure. They don't know what food they're going to have, and they can be subjected to this type of stress very, very quickly. So food security is a guarantee of an adequate, safe, nutritious, and reliable food supply. Undernutrition has decreased since the 1960s dramatically, as shown by this chart. So food security is an issue that you're going to hear about quite a bit. It's a major political issue. It's going to be a political issue forever, as far as I can tell. And people are really concerned about making sure that people have that guarantee of safe, nutritious, and reliable food. Okay. The drop in undernutrition is due to the falling cost of food. So, food prices have been rising since 2002 on average. And so what we're looking at here is the global food prices on the uptick. This is from an article that I found online, and this shows an index for the global food. What this index is from a scale of basically it starts at 100. That's the base, and the way that this works is they took the food in 2002, whatever the food price was, and averaged the food price from 2002 to 2004, and they said we'll call that 100. And what we've done now is taken those same goods and those same foods and looked at the prices in 2015, 16, all the way up through 2019. And we'll realize that the values go from 180, they dramatically drop down to 150, back up to 180, 172. So this means that this is 80% more expensive than it was in 2002 for the exact same food, right? Here it's dropped down, here it's back up to 172. This is 72.7% more expensive in 2019 than it was in 2002. So that's going to have, of course, an effect on people's ability to get access to that food. If it's more expensive, it means it's less obtainable. All right. So overnutrition is receiving too many calories each day. Developed countries have abundant, cheap junk food, and people lead sedentary lives. So if you're somebody that's, spends a lot of time sitting down or working from home or working in an office, and you're not out doing a whole lot of physical activity, and you're just getting quick snacks as opposed to eating something healthy, you're going to put on that weight. That's just what's going to happen. In the US, 25% of adults are obese, and the number is definitely going up. And worldwide, that number is at least 400 million people. That's a very, very large number for considering how far we've come, right? So, we go from starving to over 400 million obese people. Sometimes you kind of go too far on these things. Malnutrition is a shortage of nutrients the body needs. So the diet lacks adequate vitamins, minerals, protein. This could lead to diseases. This is when you're eating not just junk food, but you're just not eating anything that you should be eating at all, right? So you have to have balanced meals. Not that I'm going to get into nutrition too much in this lecture, but you have to have a balanced meal. Right? If you're just eating a crust of bread every single day with a glass of water, you're not going to get the nutrients you need to survive. You're going to wind up having problems with lack of iron, lack of potassium, things like this. So you need to have a balance of different things coming in and supplementing your body. So a lot of people don't have access to the kinds of foods that give them the diversity of food sources to give them the diversity of nutrients that they need to survive or to live a healthy life. So a lot of this production in food, granted, we've been talking about undernutrition, malnutrition, and all these other things. We still have it pretty good compared to the human condition going back, say, 100,000 years, where starvation or near starvation was the normal human mode, right? We've come a long way, and so we need to be aware of that and put some perspective into this whole thing. Now, since the spread to the developing world of the Green Revolution, we see more wheat, rice, corn, and plants that produce more and are disease and wind resistant. This is the growing of winter wheat, so that you can grow in cold areas or places in the wintertime that boosts your food supply. You grow things that are abundant and easy and low energy. Wheat and rice and corn all fit that bill. Okay. Now, a person by the name of Norman Borlaug won the Nobel Prize in 1970 for his work. And some of the things that he figured out how to do through his work in working in developing countries was to deploy wheat, rice, and corn and other crops using different techniques that we're going to describe a lot actually in this lecture, so I don't want to kind of jump too far ahead. But just to say that the Green Revolution, which introduced these concepts, produced huge yields. So here we see the wheat yields in this case in Mexico. So Mexico in 1950 was producing a wheat yield of approximately, well, just under, so let's call it 800 kilograms per hectare. And today, that number is closer, well, I mean, at one point it was up at 5,000, right? So this is a huge improvement, well over 4 times. In terms of India, it's gone from about, call it 700, right up to, I guess this looks like it's about 2,500. So this is a tripling. The same thing has happened in Pakistan. So these are places that historically have needed better nutrients and better access to food, and the Green Revolution delivered that. So let's look over here. Developing countries were able to double, triple, or even quadruple yields. India went from importing grain to exporting. So this is the Indian graph right here, and we can see that trend shows that there's tremendous productivity. What does that mean? Does it mean that they're planting huge fields and getting tremendous amounts of grain out of it? No, it means that the productivity in the very same fields they were getting before have increased by that much. So you don't have to plant more fields. I mean, you can, but you're going to get more food out of what you are planting using these techniques. That's what the Green Revolution was all about. There are positive and negative effects, so there's mixed consequences. Now, the positive effects on the environment, for one, it prevented some deforestation and land conversion. So if you're able to produce a large amount of food from existing farms, it's not really necessary, or there's not a major economic push to move out into the forest and to cut down more forest unless you absolutely had to. So you might be able to preserve part of that forest and maintain the current farms. And it preserved biodiversity and ecosystems in some areas. So there's some positives. But it also depends on some other things. It depends on heavy use of synthetic fertilizers and chemical pesticides. So in other words, this is going to the local chemical plant, Dow Chemical, or one of the other large chemical producers, and dousing your field with these chemicals. It also required a large amount of irrigation. And if you've already gone over the video on soils, especially on soil degradation and conservation, then you know the importance of proper irrigation. And if you do it improperly, you can have some serious issues, not only with the growth and the yield and the production, but also with the sustainability of that field. And then, of course, fossil fuel powered machinery came in as well. So people were no longer coming out picking corn. They were no longer coming out and planting it and using their fingers and their hands. It's all using a machine. So that has a carbon footprint that is playing a role as well. From 1900 to 2000, the cultivated area increased 33%. So that's a 1/3 increase of the cultivated area. So that's not a huge increase in the size, while the energy inputs increased 80 times. So that's an 8,000% increase, right? Whilst the land has only increased in 33%. Now the production is overwhelming. We are producing a massive amount of food. Some of it we don't even eat. We're going to get into that here in a little bit. A lot of the food we produce is actually for other purposes, and it's not really used as food. So we'll talk about that in a little bit. Another negative consequence exists on natural resources, such as the increase in pollution. And of course, it turns out it's really hard on topsoil. So loss of topsoil and soil quality. Again, go back and watch those soil videos. And if you look at the soil videos, you'll recognize that I have a couple of links in there to a couple of wonderful speakers. Go to those links in those videos and collect and select those, and you're going to get an amazing education, not just from what I said, but from what these other persons also said about soils and topsoils. So the effect is a big deal. Monoculture is another concept. We brought it up earlier, but a monoculture are large expanses of a single crop. This is another part of the Green Revolution. No longer were they engaged in polyculture. This is where they're coming in growing a single thing. It is efficient, right? And it increases output. If you grow an entire field of potatoes, which is what we're seeing here, this is a monoculture of potatoes. It's very efficient. It's very easy to do. And the reason why it's efficient and easy to do is because you can buy equipment like tractors and so on and so forth that grow only potatoes. You don't have to get a tractor that does potatoes, another one that does corn, another one that does tomatoes. You can just grow potatoes and you can absolutely make a good income doing this. All right. But it does devastate the biodiversity of that area. I mean, if you look out in this field, aside from that little group of weeds that we see out here, this is row after row of the same crop as far as the eye can see. They're probably going to hit it with some type of herbicide, but for the most part, they're growing nothing but potatoes in that field, and everything else in that field is unwelcome. All right, so this is a monoculture. And when that happens, plants are more susceptible to disease and pests. If you crowd anything of the same species all together, this is basically a city of potato plants, right? There's just this big, row after row after row. And if you crowd anything, whether it's people or plants or pigs together into a single small area, you're going to wind up with a lot of diseases of that thing surrounding that area and the pests of those things, right? If you have a lot of, if you send a lot of kids to daycare or to a K through 12 institution, what will happen is the kids will go there and they'll just pass around those diseases one to another. These plants are doing exactly the same thing. And all the pests that are attracted to these plants, they'll show up year after year, and those numbers will increase year after year. Another consequence of the Green Revolution is that the human diet has narrowed considerably as a consequence of it. It turns out 90% of our food comes from 15 crops and 8 livestock species. So basically 23 things. Many people are unaware of the fact that we're basically eating the same 23 foods 90% of the time in some mixture or variety. Okay. And we'll get into what those things are for the most part here in a few slides. But a lot of people don't really think about that. They think that they are diverse in what they eat, but in reality, they aren't. Yields in some Green Revolution regions are now starting to decline. A lot of that is due to poor stewardship of the soil. So the Green Revolution has had some dramatic effects on the food supply. And some people look at the food supply and say, there's so much food that maybe there's other things we can do with it. And at the same time, we're doing stuff with it, we could take care of farmers in an economic way. And that led to the rise of biofuels in a large number of countries in the world. In the United States, it was a huge subsidy system that went into place. Other places you can function without the subsidy system, but the United States, they've been using it for years. What is a biofuel? So a biofuel are fuels derived from organic materials, and they're designed to replace petroleum in engines. So here we see a bus. This is a double-decker bus, and in this bus, this is running on biogas, right? A common biofuel, it turns out, is ethanol. Most people have heard of ethanol, a biofuel derived from corn. In 2007, subsidies doubled production, and we have a tremendous amount of ethanol in the United States. It's blended into most of the gas that we find at most of the pumps. It's designed, it's intended to reduce the amount of pollution that comes out of the tailpipe. In other countries, you can get up to 85% ethanol. It's called E85, where it's 85% ethanol and 15% gasoline. This is really common in countries like Brazil, for example, where there's a tremendous amount of ethanol thrown off as a byproduct of their sugar industry. So by combining a little bit of gasoline with the ethanol coming out of the sugar industry, you get a very good self-sustaining or economically sustaining fuel source for your transportation fleet. Food prices have, as a consequence of this, increased, right? Because farmers are no longer selling corn for the purposes of food, they're selling it to make ethanol. And so if you have less people or less food, but this number of people are increasing, that tends to drive the prices up. So as a consequence, farmers then chased after that higher price. You know, they planted biofuels, not food crops. And as a consequence, certain places, a lot of places, riots erupted in many nations from 2007 to 2013. And these riots, some people even argue, played a major role in an important geopolitical event called the Arab Spring. There's a lot of stuff going on with these riots. Studying biofuels, I'll tell you this right now, an entire book could be written on what happened from 2007 to 2013, and we still are dealing with the ripple effects of a lot of this. However, that is definitely a place where a lot of our current food supply winds up, is in gas tanks. And there's always this ethical question of, if we have people that are underfed, should we be burning it in things like this biogas bus, right? It's an interesting question, and a lot of people have these ethical dilemmas no matter where you go. All right, so one of the things that we want to work towards is sustainable agriculture. And we talked about sustainable agriculture in our last lecture, in our last two lectures, in fact. So sustainable agriculture is agriculture that does not deplete soils faster than they form. It does not reduce the amount of healthy soil. It does not pollute the water, and it does not decrease genetic diversity. In fact, it should increase the level of genetic diversity. To give you an idea of how a good sustainable agriculture experiment or a good sustainable farm should operate, or what it would look like, here's an image that we see right here. Here we see rows of different plants. Sometimes they're intercropped, right, with different things, but nowhere, shape, or form is this all a giant monoculture. And this will be rotated around year after year. And so these are students that are learning how to do sustainable farming. Other things that we're doing is no-till farming and other soil conservation methods that help make agriculture more sustainable. We're working hard to reduce fossil fuel inputs and pollution. And in many ways, we're using new approaches that move away from the industrial agriculture model. So the Green Revolution, while it gave us a good shove into the direction of getting people fed and getting the economy going so that people can actually do other things besides just worry about their own existence, worry about their own surviving, right? Now, all of a sudden, they're able to produce other things in the economy. They are able to do scholarly work. They're able to do construction. They're able to erect libraries. They get involved in IT and things like this. This gives them opportunities that they didn't have before. And as a consequence of this revolution, we're now going towards the opportunity to be able to say, well, maybe there's a way to get the same kind of food out of this, but without the bad inputs that we're putting in, right? The soil erosion and the degradation of nutrients and the reduction of diversity and things like this. So let's talk about that. So raising animals for food. So food from cropland agriculture makes up the majority of the human diet. Most people also eat animal products. So we're eating from farms all over the world, okay? Consuming animal products has environmental, social, agricultural, and economic impacts. And we want to talk about what these impacts are. In terms of what we're doing in terms of our production and what we're eating, since 1950, global meat production has increased fivefold and per capita meat consumption has doubled. So while the amount of meat that is being produced has gone up 500%, right? It's a fivefold increase. And the population has doubled, right? So that means everybody's eating more meat. And here we see that production right here. This is meat production by livestock type. So we have wild game, duck. Believe it or not, people still eat horse. It's not uncommon in certain parts of the world. Goose and guinea, fowl, sheep and goat, beef and buffalo, pig meat, poultry. So that's what each one of these lines are going to. And of course, poultry, pig meat, beef, and buffalo are the largest ones. And of course, the largest increase seems to be occurring right here in the poultry region, right? So from 1960, we were a very, very small sliver in 1961, but by 2018, it was a very large sliver of the overall meat consumption market. So as wealth and commerce increase, so does meat, milk, and egg consumption. Domestic animals raised for food increased from 71 million tons in 1961 to 341 million tons in 2018. That's a huge jump, almost a five-fold jump, right? Just since 1961. The amount of food we're talking about is incredible. Meat consumption is expected to double again by 2050. It's just staggering how much consumption is happening. And the Green Revolution is really what's providing most of that production. It also turns out that our food choices are also energy choices. And we talked about matter and energy way early in this lecture series. And so we've got to bring that back, right? So it turns out that eating meat is far less energy efficient than eating crops. 90% of energy is lost from one trophic level to the next. So as you're going from one step to the next in that food chain, you're losing 90% of the energy on average, right? Now, it does turn out in detail, it gets a little bit more complicated. So eating lower on the food chain feeds more people, it turns out, because you're losing less energy, right? So if everybody was vegetarian, you could feed everybody very, very effectively on planet Earth. It's when everybody wants to have a steak or they want to eat large amounts of meat that we start to have problems. So it turns out some animals convert grain into meat more efficiently than others. This is not surprising, but when we look at this, it makes sense, right? So this is the level of feed input on this part of the diagram. Over here is the animal. This is the produce output. So it turns out if you feed a beef 20 kilograms of feed, you'll get 1 kilogram of beef coming out the other side. So that's a 20-to-1 ratio. But pork is more efficient, 7.3 kilograms for 1 kilogram of pork. So if you're interested in eating meat, but you want to be also environmentally conscious, between beef and pork, you should be picking pork, right? But you can even do better, right? Eggs are 4.5 kilograms of feed will produce 1 kilogram of chicken eggs. So here we see it's a 4.5-to-1 ratio. Or you can be even more efficient. Don't eat the eggs. Let's just go ahead and eat the chicken itself. Well, 2.8 kilograms of chicken feed will result in 1 kilogram of chicken. And then, of course, if you want to be extremely efficient and you don't like to eat the beef, but you do like to drink milk, well, you're actually in good company environmentally. 1.1 kilograms of milk or feed into the cattle will produce 1 kilogram of milk. So there's a very high level of efficiency if you're going to drink milk versus if you're going to eat the cow itself. Okay. So it turns out producing eggs and chicken meat requires the least space and water, so it's efficient. Producing beef requires the most, so that's what we see here in this chart. Foods from different animals have different ecological footprints as well, and we're going to talk about those. In order to really understand why that happens, though, we have to understand a couple of important things. The biggest thing here that we see are these feedlots. So feedlots are factory farms, also called concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. These are huge warehouses or pens that deliver food to animals living at extremely high densities. And so here we see a feedlot. This is actually a feedlot with pretty low density compared to most. In fact, the farmers here actually go out of their way to try to be as humane as possible in this feedlot so that they're not overpacking them. But it's not uncommon to find it so that there's no space out here with no cattle at all. Or I mean, no space at all for cattle. It's just cattle as far as you can see. What this does is it increases production and lowers costs. So you bring this cattle in here, you feed it, you keep it sedentary so it puts on large amounts of weight. It can get quite heavy, and it allows you to get more weight onto the cattle, and therefore get more meat per unit or per head of cattle. Over half of the world's pork and most of the poultry come from feedlots, and 45% of the global grain production goes to livestock. So this is a tremendous amount of food that is just going to feed cattle, right? Whether most of it beef, but it could also go to pork, it could go to chickens, it can go to other things. It does turn out there's some environmental benefits. It reduces grazing impacts on the land. We talked about the impact of grazing on soils. And the manure, of course, can be applied to the fields as fertilizer. So here we see all this manure. They're actually walking around in their own waste. there's significant issues with that. And this is that issue. Feedlots produce huge amounts of manure and urine. This stuff pollutes surface and groundwater and can lead to eutrophication. Usually there's large wastewater lagoons on a lot of these farms to kind of deal with that, to accumulate this waste. This is pretty toxic stuff, quite frankly. They're basically large toilets, and here we see an image of a farm, and here we see the wastewater lagoons just full of sewage. It has not only does it have the manure and the urine, but the urine has large amounts of pharmaceuticals in it because these cattle are in close confinement on these feedlots. You see that here and you see it here. And so you got to give them antibiotics. And so these antibiotics also wind up in these wastewater lagoons. So this is some pretty nasty stuff. It doesn't go into a sewage treatment plant as we would normally see with human waste. So this is stuff that usually winds up in the environment in some way, shape, or form. Waterborne pathogens can sicken people. This is not something you'd want to swim around in at all or even be near. Crowded conditions require heavy use of antibiotics to prevent disease outbreaks. Microbes evolve resistance to antibiotics. There's a tremendous amount of stuff going on here, a lot of difficulties that are happening with these microbes. We're going to get into how resistance comes about shortly. But it's not just with beef. Turns out we do this with chicken as well and pork. So to spur growth, animals are often fed hormones and heavy metals, and the chemicals can be transferred to people. So this is what hormones, for example, have done to chickens. This is in 1950. This is a chick in 1957. This is a chick in 1978. Here's one 2005. So this one in 1957, after 0 days, is 34 grams. At 28 days, it's 316 grams. And after 56 days, it's full grown, and it's 905 grams on average. Let's go ahead and skip 1978. You can see that it's larger and go straight to 2005, where hormones are in full production. They're used all the time. This is your typical chicken. It's already 44 grams right out of the egg. By the time it's 28 days along, it's already larger than a full-grown 1957 chicken was. And by the time it's 56 days, it's 4.2 kilograms, 4,202 grams. So it's over 4 times larger. And this is what most people in the world are eating. And these hormones are being consumed by human beings. And yes, it has an effect on you as well. The impacts on the environment, the impacts on the animals, the impacts on humans are still being studied. But you can look at this and tell this might not be a good outcome. Right? There's something going on here. There's a reason why organic chicken, for example, is more expensive and the chicken is a little bit smaller. It's because it's fitting more of this mold than we see over here, because you're not allowed to use hormones in organic. All right? But this is common, feedlot chicken today. Feedlots produce odor and more greenhouse gases than automobiles do. CO2, methane, nitrous oxides. These are really nasty chemicals. And here we see a feedlot full of chickens, right? So this is a old chicken coop. It's not even old. It's actually a modern chicken coop. And so most of the chickens you've probably ever eaten in your life, especially if you lived in a developed country, come from an environment probably similar to this. Most people don't eat the wholesome farm-grown chickens that you see in pictures. This is probably what you see, or what you're probably eating whenever you go and get a chicken sandwich or you get one of those broiled chickens from a major retailer like Costco or Walmart. So it's not just with chicken, it's not just with pork and with beef. It turns out we're also doing something similar with our fish. We tend to raise a lot of seafood using aquaculture. So the reason why we got involved in aquaculture, and we'll get into what it is here in a minute, is that world fish populations are plummeting. That's just an objective fact. And technology and increased demand led to overharvesting. People just wanted to eat the fish. That drove the price up. And so people started saying, maybe we could start farming it. And you probably have heard of farm fish. If you ever go to the meat market or you go to the butcher section of your grocery store, you'll usually look at the fish and the fish will say farmed or they'll say fresh. Something like this. If it says it's farmed, it means it was involved in aquaculture. This is the raising of aquatic organisms in a controlled environment. So instead of letting it swim wild in a river or swim wild out in the ocean. You're going to be growing it in a pen. So these are species that are raised in open water pens or land-based ponds. And I'll show you an image in the next slide of what that looks like. This is what we've seen in terms of the production of aquaculture in 1950. Basically, everything was capture production. In other words, these are fishermen going out into the open ocean, grabbing fish and selling it on the market. And that number has actually continuously gone up right up until about 1995. Right around 1995, it looks like we plateaued, at least temporarily. We don't know where we're going to go in the future. But we plateaued, and there's actually a slight dip. And what we see instead is a very rapid increase in the difference between what we actually consume and the amount we actually capture is made up by aquaculture, which has developed technology since the 1960s. We can see that this sliver has gotten very large to the point where it's producing, let's see here, if we follow that bar over, it looks like we're right at about 90 million tons on capture production. And on top of that is another, 50, or let's call it 60 million tons, right? So 90 million is capture out in the open ocean and in our rivers and lakes. Another 60 million tons is aquaculture. So you might make the assumption that this is actually good. And we're going to talk about ways that it might be good. It turns out over 220 freshwater and marine species are grown that way. The fastest growing type of food production right now, and it's growing much faster than capture production, which is of course leveled off. We can see that here in the graph. So that's good, right? Instead of going out and harvesting directly from the ocean, there shouldn't be any problems. Well, it does have its benefits and it has its negative impacts, and a lot of those negative impacts mirror the exact same things we see with chickens and with beef and with pork. The benefits are, one, it's a reliable protein source. Two, it can be sustainable if we do it right. It reduces pressure on over-harvested wild fish, and it reduces something called bycatch. These are when you accidentally catch things that you're not intending to catch. If you're trying to catch salmon, you accidentally catch a dolphin. That's a bycatch, or a shark. And they can be very energy efficient. The negative impacts, like I said, are exactly the same as what we see with the cattle and with the chickens, right? Disease required expensive antibiotics. So here we see these pens in here, and they are being treated with antibiotics. There's lots of waste. Sometimes, so you can imagine, there's a bunch of fish in here, and they're just waste. That waste is coming straight out of that pen right onto the sea floor, and it's concentrated. Sometimes fed wild-caught fish, this is just kind of normal in the industry, uses grain that might otherwise go to people. So this is fish that sometimes where you just take grain grown from the land and just dumped into these pens. And of course, escaped fish may introduce disease or outcompete wild fish in the area. So these are major concerns, and they're growing concerns. In some places, we actually find these invasive species fish that are in fact driving out native fish out of freshwater lagoons, local or even coastal lagoons. This is particularly a big deal in Mexico with the tilapia, which is taking over many of the old fisheries because it can outcompete the native fish that were there for forever. In terms of crop diversity, this is something, we're down to 23 things that we're eating all the time. If we don't preserve our diversity, we have a major problem because crop diversity provides insurance against failure. So preserving native variants protects against crop failure in case something bad happens. Turns out monocultures are extremely vulnerable to disease. We mentioned that a little bit earlier. Wild relatives contain genes that can provide resistance to disease and pests, and we have lost a great deal of genetic diversity in crops. I want to bring up the issue of what happens when you have a monoculture and that monoculture gets a disease. And the best example that I can think of in my mind is the Gros Michel banana. The Gros Michel banana is a banana that was grown all over the world. It was the most popular type of banana by far. It was strong, it could be transported, it was very tasty, and you could buy, I think the price was you can get 2 bananas for the price of an apple, and that was the goal of the banana companies, was to make it more appealing, not only taste-wise, but cost-wise than the apple. And it became the world's most popular fruit. And what happened is a disease, and I think it was called Panama disease, if I can remember, a disease actually went through the Gros Michel crop and wiped it out. And effectively, it grows only locally in special locations, but it can't be grown commercially. So it's commercially extinct now. And the current banana that most people eat now is called the Cavendish. The Cavendish was considered a secondary fruit. It wasn't nearly as good as the Gros Michel. It bruises more easily. It's less transportable. But because they didn't have the Gros Michel anymore to grow, they started growing the Cavendish, and the world adopted it as a second best option. Well, it turns out that there's a version of Panama disease that is starting to spread and to affect the Cavendish crop. So we might lose commercially the Cavendish just like we lost the Gros Michel. So we see here images of the Gros Michel in different stages of ripening. You can still get them. People grow them in Africa, and you can buy them. The problem is that you can't normally get them at the grocery store. They're not commercially available. There's a possibility of being able to solve this problem using genetically modified organisms, GMO Gros Michel or GMO Cavendish, but we haven't gotten to that yet. Okay, we haven't even gotten to what a GMO is. We'll get into that mainly in the next lecture. Now, we have lost a great deal of genetic diversity in crops. Only 30% of the corn varieties in Mexico in 1930 still exist today. That means 70% of them are gone. In the United States, many fruit and vegetable crops have decreased 90% in diversity. Food producers prefer uniform, standardized food because their equipment is set up for it. It's more economical, and you're just basically going to get those 23 things unless you demand something different at the grocery store. Otherwise, you're just going to keep, if you're eating cereal for breakfast and you're eating a sandwich at lunch, you're eating wheat with more wheat, with maybe some jelly and some peanut butter on it if you're an American, or some other type of thing in your sandwich, maybe a little turkey. But you get the idea, right? You're not getting a whole lot of diversity, even though you think you're getting diversity in your food. Not like what existed before, say, the 1930s. So to deal with this concern of decrease of diversity, many governments and many private organizations in the world have gotten involved in investing in these things called seed banks. Now, seed banks are institutions that preserve seed types as living museums of genetic diversity. So seeds are collected, they're stored, and periodically planted. There's 1,400 seed banks which house 1 to 2 million distinct types of seeds worldwide. And here's a seed bank right here. This is the Millennial Vault in the UK. It's under development right now, and probably in a couple of years after I release this video, it'll be an active seed bank. There's some really big ones. There's the internationally funded Svalbard Global Seed Vault, which is the so-called Doomsday Seed Vault. It's almost like a Noah's Ark of seeds. So if things ever went bad on planet Earth, we can reseed the Earth. Stores millions of seeds from seed banks around the world in case of global agricultural calamity. So there's a concern. People are worried about this. So beyond the seeds, there's another aspect we have to be concerned about. It turns out pollination is another big part of our agriculture and our food supply. Turns out that not all insects are pests. Some are absolutely vital. There's 800 crop species that rely on insect pollinators. So what is it we mean by pollinator? So pollination is where the male plant cells or sex cells fertilize female sex cells. And this is usually done by wind or animals. Wind, if you're in the springtime or in the late winter or even in the early summer, there's usually a big bloom that happens and a large number of flowers come out, and there's pollen in the air, and some of your allergies really start to hit. And you can feel it. That's all that pollen in the air as these plants are trying to reproduce. The pollination can happen by wind or by animals. So some animals or some plants kind of manipulate animals to do their work for them, to do the pollination. And so here we see, for example, a pollen-covered honeybee that's going bee to bee. It's collecting pollen. It's feeding a little bit on the nectar, but it's going from flower to flower doing this. And as it does it, it's transferring these sex cells, these male sex cells, from one plant to another. Common pollinators include hummingbirds, bats, all kinds of insects, bees, wasps, mosquitoes actually as well can be pollinators. Native bees provide 3 billion in yearly pollination services in the United States alone. So without the pollination, you're not going to produce a lot of, most plants don't produce unless they've been pollinated. They don't produce any food. So this is a big deal in the food supply. Now, we have to protect the pollinators because without the pollinators, you don't get pollination. Without pollination, you don't get food. It's just like soil, right? You need to have the pollination in the soil, and otherwise the plants really can't do their thing. The honeybee pollinates over 100 crops that make up 1/3 of the U.S. diet and contributes well over 15 billion in services per year. You could go out, for example, human beings can go out, we could pollinate trees, and you'll actually see this happen in some countries. I actually have a video of a Japanese farmer coming out into his field in Japan and actually taking two flowers and putting them together and rubbing. I think he has a little brush and he brushes the one onto the other, and he basically does the job that the honeybee does. And the amount of money that it would cost for human beings to go out and do this would be in the billions. In this case, in the U.S. alone, $15 billion a year. The bees just do it for free. However, populations of pollinators, especially bees, have plummeted. And there's something called colony collapse disorder that's happening where entire beehives have just vanished. And we don't really know why. It's still something that's being investigated. There might be a number of causes. There might be a single cause. I know that people are starting to narrow down what the ideas might be, but some of the top candidates for it is that maybe it's insecticides. Could it be parasites? Could it be stress from human beings in the area impacting their environment? One of the ideas currently being investigated is the idea that it might be insecticides. Low levels of insecticides used as an agricultural insecticide does seem to be pretty common in the United States. And so here we see the use of land of this particular type of insecticide all over the plant or all over the United States. And it does turn out that we have honeybee impacts in these exact same locations. Is that a coincidence? I don't know. It's a pretty interesting idea, and there's a lot of work being done, not just on this pesticide or insecticide, but many insecticides. Reducing or eliminating pesticide use and planting flowering plants will help preserve bees. That's the current idea. And so you can go out and grow pollinator gardens and things like this. And pollinator gardens always make sure that there's some place where the bees can go to make sure they get what they need. And they can move from that pollinator garden and go and pollinate the rest of that ecosystem. So pollinator gardens are becoming a fad in the United States in a lot of areas. And it's not a bad one. It's not a bad fad to have. It's a really good one. All right, so let's talk about pests and weeds that might be hindering agriculture. So a pest is any organism that damages valuable crops. That's anything. So if you're trying to grow corn and something's affecting it or eating it, that's a pest. It could be a mouse, it could be a fungi, it could be whatever. A weed is any plant that competes with the crops in that field. So they come in different forms. Here's a common weed that we see in the United States. This is a wide-leaved, sprawling weed. It's kind of big. It pushes out other things, and it makes it difficult for other plants to compete. And so you can imagine if you're trying to grow something like a radish next to this, it could be a little stressful on what you're trying to grow. So industrial farming limits natural mechanisms to control pest and weed populations. So when we say natural mechanisms, we're going in with a monoculture, we're plowing the field and everything, and these plants have no natural mechanism to fight them off, right? So this usually is done through chemical means, right? Using a pesticide or an herbicide. So a pesticide are poisons that target pest organisms, and there's 3 different kinds. There's insecticides that kill insects, herbicides that kill plants, and fungicides that kill fungi. 400 million kilograms. This is 900 million pounds. I mean, this is incredible. Pesticides are applied in the United States each year, right onto the soil, right into the fields. And this is in our food supply. We eat this. This winds up in the food supply. It winds up in the water supply, in the rivers and in the creeks. It's got to be having an effect, right? I mean, it's naive to think that it's not going to have some effect somewhere. 4-fold increase in use of pesticides worldwide since 1960. 32 billion per year spent on pesticides alone. Now, pests, it turns out, don't take this line down. We're all genetic organisms. And so it turns out genetics and mutation go hand in hand. It turns out some individuals are genetically immune to pesticide. It might just be a genetic advantage or a physical advantage that they have. And if they happen to have that, then they're going to pass those genes that allowed them to survive onto their offspring. and the non-resistant pests are killed off. Let's give you an example of how this works. So here we have a leaf with a series of pests, and the red one right here, it's going to be resistant or it's going to be immune to the pesticide. The white one is not, right? So these are exactly the same species, except the white ones are not immune, whereas the red one is. And so we apply that pesticide. And so on that leaf, we now have a immune one that survived, right? It was just this one. Then the former ones might only have 2 of them that survive. And then they reproduce. And so after that reproduction, you can see immediately there's an increase in the number of specimens that are immune to the point where it's 50-50. You apply another pesticide to it, it wipes out the non-immune ones, preferentially. The ones that are immune aren't affected, and now they become the dominant species in that area. So that pesticide is no longer working. If anything, it's helping the immune group improve its chances of survival by wiping out its competitors, right? So pesticides stop being effective, and it creates something called the pesticide treadmill. So chemists change chemicals or increase toxicity to compete with resistant pests. So to wipe these things out, these ones that are resistant, you got to use something even more nasty than you had before. So pesticides are getting worse. They're getting stronger. They're getting more powerful, and they're doing more damage, right? It's not becoming safer. It's becoming less safe over time. Over 586 insect species are resistant to 330 pesticides now in the market. Pesticides also kill non-target organisms, including predators and parasites of pests. So things that would normally wipe them out, sometimes you use a pesticide that would normally take this thing out, and then the pesticide kills what would have taken that out. So that helps it too. Again, it enhances its survivability, the exact opposite of what you're hoping it's going to do. And as a consequence, pest populations become harder to control over time. This is the exact opposite of what we're hoping. It turns out nature's very good at dealing with pests as long as you don't have a huge concentration of monoculture in an area. If you have diversity, you're able to deal with this very effectively. One of the ways that nature does this is through biocontrol, and human beings can take advantage of biocontrol. So biocontrol is a strategy that uses a pest predators or parasites to control the pest. So under biocontrol, this is where human beings are coming in and doing it. Nature, of course, limits things because if you have enough food, what happens is then the carrying capacity of a predator goes up and the numbers then come up and match that, and it eats that food supply back down. And so it's constantly keeping the ecosystem from getting out of whack. So parasitoid wasps are commonly used group of biocontrol agents, and what the parasitoids do is they're wasps that come in, they lay their eggs in insect hosts. Those insects, they're then killed when the babies come out, and it reduces pest populations without chemicals. Another thing that is kind of interesting is what we call BT. I can't even pronounce that, but it's called BT in the industry. This is a soil bacterium that kills many caterpillars and some fly and beetle larvae. It's a really interesting bacterium, and a lot of plants coexist with this bacterium, and we're going to get into BT a little bit in the next lecture when we get into genetic modification. But this is a very interesting one. It is risky to introduce an organism from a foreign ecosystem into a new ecological context, however. So, here we see a ladybug that's munching on all these aphids right here. It naturally eats them. But the ladybug has been intentionally introduced into large areas of the world because it eats aphids, but it's not native to that area. And in some places, it's become a pest. It's become a problem in and of itself, and it actually outcompetes other positive ecosystem participants in those areas. So one of the ways that we can deal with this is by using different techniques, right? So we call this integrated pest management, IPM. It's the use of a mix of techniques to suppress pests in an area. So we can use pest population monitoring, biocontrol, and mechanical pest removal. This means you're going out there and you're actually picking these things up and removing them. Chemicals if necessary. Crop rotation, alternative tillage methods, We can use transgenic crops. These are GMOs, right? GMOs, it turns out we can program genetically plants to be resistant to certain predators and certain pests, okay? IPM in Indonesia increased rice yields by 13%. It cut pesticide use in half and saved $179 million per year and phased out subsidies. This is what we call a good all around. Here's a nice chart showing all these different things that go into an IPM from this website I've got listed right here. Soil preparation, planting, forecasting, pest trapping, monitoring, thresholds, cultural controls, biological controls, chemical controls, record keeping. You put them all together into an integrated management system, and you can get some very good results. But that still leads us to the idea of using all of these controls. And the question is going to be, is there a better way to do this? Do you like pesticides on your food? Do you like systems of monoculture? You can see this is a field that is designed for food, and there's a gentleman spraying pesticides on this farmer, and he himself cannot even breathe the air in the very field where food that children eventually will eat is coming from. So is there a better way to do this? That's going to be a question for the very next lecture. It turns out that there's not always easy answers, but some answers kind of are easy. So we're going to talk about that in the next lecture, and I'm glad you hung out for this one. And we'll see you next time. Take care. Bye.